Hello everyone, I think we'll get started here. So just to clarify and make sure you're at the session you think you should be at, it's the identification of deafblindness, the Nordic way, and assessment material in progress. Everybody good so far? Great. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our speakers this afternoon. We have Annika, Maria Johansson. She has a Master of Science in Communication and Congenital Deafblindness. She works as a Senior Advisor at Stepted Center of Special Education in the Department of Deafblindness and Dual Visual and Hearing Impairment, situated in Bergen, Norway. She has about 25 years of clinical experience with the field of special education. You must have started when you were 3. And about 16 of those towards people with deafblindness. Annika has a special interest in how to understand the bodily-tactile modalities' impact on learning and development. Also with us this afternoon, we have Rasmus Peterson. Rasmus is a psychologist and project manager working at the Specialist Consultancy for the Deafblind in the North Denmark region. Working in the practice field, he bridges the gap between research and practice by focusing on knowledge development and building competence in the different kinds of projects. Projects about Usher syndrome sparked his interest, and projects about Usher syndrome and the qualitative experiences of people with Usher syndrome sparked his interest and have been his starting point for working in the deafblind field. He is still very interested in the qualitative experiences of people living with deafblindness, as well as the perspectives of the relatives, and believes that these aspects can offer a lot to the knowledge development in the deafblind field. Though he is biased working alongside very experienced consultants and in the practice field, one of the things he also focuses on is how research can be made applicable to practice. So please join me in welcoming our speakers this afternoon.
Can we stand down here? Is this work? Oh, this is working. So my name is Annika. Rasmus and myself is a part of the Danish-Norwegian working group on this project. And since this was supposed to be a little bit interactive and we are just going to inform you a lot, so we thought maybe to start out to having a kind of druddle or discussion around the tables about those two questions. Do you identify in your do you identify deafblindness in your country, and how do you do it? So take a minute and two and reflect on that with your people sitting next to you, and then we will come back with that to draw the attention on the end of the session. Okay? And we will time you. Okay, time flies in nice conversations. Wow, did you know that 2 minutes is so... Yeah. But it is, we have something more to tell you guys. So, shh. So now I give the floor to Rasmus, and we will change a little bit during this presentation.
Yeah, so thank you everyone, and thank you for being here. It's nice to have just filled up our stomach. I think studies say that if you have just been to lunch and then come back afterwards, you're more like comfortable, and I hope so right now. And don't ask any critical questions because but yeah, yes do. But yeah, I will just begin. My name is Rasmus, and yeah, so to understand the identification, we need to turn towards the Nordic definition as a starting point. The first Nordic definition was developed in 1980, and it has been revised since a couple of times. It was latest revised in 2016 to this definition. And I'm not going to go through all the specifications of the Nordic definitions, but I want to highlight some of the most important paragraphs here. First of all, it states that deafblindness is a combined vision and hearing impairment of such severity that it's hard for the impaired senses to compensate for each other. Thus, deafblindness is a distinct disability. Secondly, it says that in its main implication, to varying degrees, deafblindness limits activities and restricts full participation in society. It affects social life, communication, access to information, orientation, and the ability to move around freely and safely. To help compensate for the combined vision and hearing impairment, especially the tactile sense becomes important. So yeah, the definition is having a functional focus, acknowledging that the combined sensory loss makes a unique impairment and cannot be solely based on the objective criteria of vision and hearing. We need to consider how vision and hearing in everyday functions in everyday life in the domains such as social life, such as in communication, access to information, and orientation, and the ability to move around freely and safely. So how are or can the impaired senses compensate for each other? This definition has a background in the ICF, the International Classification of Functioning. Walter mentioned it earlier today. So how the individual functions in the environment. So how is the individual impacted by the impairment, and how is activity and participation limited and restricted? How can environmental and personal factors impact how the person actually functions in society? Sorry. So to understand the definition, we will also need to know the thoughts and the context that have shaped this perspective. These are in particular a human rights perspective with regards to the United Nations Convention of the Rights for People with Disabilities. It's also a dynamic focus towards the interplay between the individual and the environment, knowing that the environment can improve or worsen the impact of the functional impairment. And furthermore, we hold a dialogical perspective in the Nordic countries. And in very brief terms, this means that to understand others, ourselves, and what we experience, we need the reactions and perspectives of others. As professionals working with deafblindness, we need to give people with deafblindness experience of that they have a voice of their own, that they are worth noticing. It's crucial for building a sense of self and developing an agency. Next, I'm going to focus on the task of this project. What are we going to achieve during this project, and why so? So, the task was given by the Nordic Leadership Forum. The task was to coordinate the identification process of deafblindness in the Nordic countries by taking the Nordic identification material on congenital deafblindness as a starting point. This is to ensure the best possible identification of deafblindness, which in turn form the basis for good intervention. So a working group with members from my organization at the Specialist Consultancy for the Deafblind in Denmark, and the Norwegian organization StatPet, led by a project manager from Nordic Welfare Center, took up this assignment. So we were to develop an identification material that could be used systematically in the Nordic countries. And it has to be based on the shared Nordic definition. It has to take into account recent knowledge on deafblindness and the sensory system, and it has to be made applicable by the different systems in the Nordic countries. And it has to be an accessible material too. So, why is it necessary to develop a new material? Yeah, we were using the Nordic definition, but earlier we had Nordic identification material that has been used. Inger Rødbro and Karen Andersen had in 2000 developed an identification material which especially focused on congenital deafblindness, and later materials have followed, but they haven't been shared in the Nordic countries. So we have no shared materials and outdated materials which needs to be revised with new knowledge, which also made the material a lot less applicable for the organizations. So though we use the Nordic definition, we have different ways in the Nordic countries, and we have different systems to identify deafblindness. In the end, this might result in differences in the population and a variation on the focus on deafblindness in each country. So this was really a concern that we needed to act on to have this shared Nordic focus on deafblindness. Yeah, to understand the material and the processes in the material, two perspectives must be mentioned here. First of all, this material and the identification process is built on a dynamic assessment approach in which we try to find out the developmental potentials of the individual. And we want to use this material to get an understanding on how we, by changing or adapting the environment, can make the most of the different senses, the visual, hearing, or the tactile sense. Very briefly, dynamic assessment is an approach where you can make a baseline, a pre-observation or pre-test, then you would have an intervention with some thoughts on how you can create an environment where the individual might use the tactile sense or the residual senses. Afterwards, you would make a post-test, a post-observation, to see if the intervention has had an effect. So this approach gives us valuable insight on how to create a developmental and the learning strategies of the individual. But it's also important to understand another perspective that might be a bit dualistic. But this kind of dualism is also found in the Nordic definition, as you see. So it says, to understand how vision and hearing is impacted, we need to look at the difficulties of using these two senses, and especially answering whether these two senses are able to compensate for each other. But furthermore, we especially look at assets and potential when looking at the tactile sense. So to help compensate for the combined vision and hearing impairment, especially the tactile sense becomes important. We need to balance these two kinds of perspectives in the material, both a focus on the difficulties, but also on the assets and the potentials. So, I have just... Yeah, earlier I have mentioned these different domains here, or what we tend to call them, that is specified in the Nordic definition. That is social life, that is communication, that is access to information, and orientation and the free movement. So making a distinction between these different domains is rather difficult, and we have drawn a line between communication, access to information, and orientation and movement. However, social life is somehow interconnected in all of these three domains and is also affected by the other domains. So in evaluating how the use of the senses impacts the daily life, and whether to consider if the person can be identified with deafblindness, social life is a very important domain. So the environment needs to consider these areas and domains to make conditions. So just like partner competence and access to the surroundings, it could be create coherent and meaningful activity and experiences, focus on the physical conditions and also on the supportive age, just to mention a few of the things. And now I have talked a lot, so I guess I will give the word to Annika, who's going to tell us a little bit about the process.
Thank you.
Here you go.
Something in the closet falling down. Yes, you hear me well? Yep. Now I'm gonna try to talk, looking at my notes, look at my computer and try to change things at the same time. So if you can't see what I'm talking about, just give me a nod. Anyway, so the developmenting of the material. So we were working in working groups, and we were set down by, now I'm looking at Henrietta here, because she was one of the starting points, yes, to put us in different groups, working groups, due to the different areas of senses actually were the start point of the working group. So we have working group of hearing and seeing and the bodily-tactile modality, and I'm a part of the latter. So, and I need glasses. So we were collaborating between the working groups. We had, after working for a year or something like that, we had this focus group on our first draft concerning all the Nordic countries, not Finland, but for those of you who knows the Nordic countries and what they are, who they are. So it was not Finland, but it was Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway. Yeah, that's the Nordic countries and Finland. and we had this group of, the working group at that moment, and the focus group, they were really like looking at our material, because we did it due to the census at that time, and they were like, so what are we assessing here or identifying? Are we assessing census or are we identifying deafblindness? And I think that was one of the best comments they came with. Obviously it was lots of other comments. So that means we divided, or we changed due to the model of the functional definition and the domain that Rasmus was already talking about. Ugh, I'm nervous. So anyway, and I will go to see the next, and then I have to pick this and this. This is Rasmus has done this very fancy thing. And yes, so and I'm not so young. So the structure, how it is today, is based on an introduction to the identification material. Then is the actually tool or the functional assessment of the sensory areas. And then it's a part of the evaluation of the functional use of the senses. Yep. And the evaluation is obviously due to the domains of the Nordic functional definition. So, and so, after, as I said, the focus group, we got the feedback. And then we changed it to look like this. And we tried to make a model. Is the, yep. So we basically, obviously we assess the senses when we identify deafblindness. Obviously we do that. But to make it more comparative with the functional definition, so we try to look up on the different domain due to the different sensory modalities. So it looks basically a little bit like this. So there we have the observational reference points. So we have within the social interaction and communication, we have vision, we have hearing, and we have bodily-tactile senses. The same for access to information, and the same for orientation, and the ability to move freely and safely. And it consists with different observational cues. Ooh. Yeah, so you can see that every domain have different cues, and maybe that's, sometimes we are thinking, oh wow, should everything be the same? But maybe we don't need that either. So at the moment we are heading on with 61 observational reference points. And that's quite a lot. So we're going to do a pilot that we will going to talk more about this next half year. And then we will come back to see if is these points of references useful or not. Or is it too much, is it too little? Is the framework of it okay or whatever? Yeah. So one of the questions could be, or the observational cue, is the person able to be a part of an auditive turn-taking on hearing, for example? And for example, does the person actively use their bodily tactile sense to identify similarities or differences between objects? That could be different, just an example of these reference points or observational cues. From each domain, how we think it will happen when it goes digital and everything like that. So this is just a visual example for you guys to see now. So maybe it's not going to be like this, but we do think we can score these observational cues in a dynamic way, and then you can easily have a visual overview of which area that will how the intervention has gone. Like for us, the bodily-tactile modality to compensate, for example, will easily be seen here. It will be connected to the observational cue, and it will also have in the reporting what exactly type of intervention has been done. So this is just what we think is quite neat after a while. And since it's a lot of GDPR stuff due to these things, because we are different countries, so we have landed at the moment that it will be anonymous, yeah, you understand me? Anonymt, we say in Norwegian. and so that could be, if possible, we don't know that yet. Also, neat idea for further research. After a while, you can just have these anonymous type of graphs that also represent different cues and how. So it could be, but that's a could be, and it's lots of restrictions and everything like that. So we don't know. But in our hoping that we are really doing something like that.
Annika,
yeah.
Could you quickly just come back?
Is that the red?
That's the red button, right? So just to comment on this figure, because I think it's a very complex figure with a lot of different stuff in it. So I guess that it needs to be explained a bit further. It was like the dynamic assessment approach that I explained about earlier. When you had and you have done a pre-observation, that's the red line in the figure, and then you would do a post-observation, that's the green line in the figure, and to see if your intervention has made an effect. And here in the proposed example, and this person who's completely it's not right.
A person.
It's not a person. Yeah. We could see that the person is not is using the vision senses and is not using the hearing senses. So in the different observational cues that we see pointed in, but yeah, and we have tried to. We took inspiration from the tactile working memory scale in doing so, where you have present, emerging, or absent categories for seeing if the ability of the observational crew is regarded as such. Yeah. So yeah, just to comment on some of the things.
Yeah, and also because of our definition, it's also, I just need to say that, because we have started out with the most complex cases. So now it's been developed by people who mainly work with congenital deafblindness and identification of congenital deafblindness. Earlier, or later on, we will also add the expertise from the acquired field. And obviously, you don't do very rare, maybe, because they have a language, you can interview them about their things. You may not need so much intervention, but maybe sometimes you do. So it's like they will be invited because it's going to be material for deafblindness, not acquired or congenital. It's like deafblindness as such, yeah. Because that's what our definition is. It's not acquired or congenital. That's, yeah. Okay, now we were. So, and the third phase of it, it's like the evaluation of the use of senses. So basically it will be a qualitative description and recommendations and conclusions. So, and questions asked is, are hearing or vision, I can't see, yeah. Are hearing or vision able to compensate for each other? How is social life, communication, access to information, orientation, and the ability to move around freely and safely affected? The role of the bodily tactile sense in compensating for the vision and hearing. That will lead to the question, is this an ongoing identification process? Is it need for more assessment or counseling desirable because of the type of progressive condition or other issues? And also the end of a kind of report will be a recommendation for future interventions and initiatives that will impact counseling and service. Yeah. And now we change again.
Yeah, we change again, right. So you can just hand me this one. Thank you. So yeah, it's still a work in progress, and we have the next step lined in here. So right now we're doing some pilot testing of the material in the different Nordic countries. And afterwards it would, of course, as Annika said, need some revisement. So we are also considering an education on actually using this material and do Nordic identification. So this will benefit both the implementation, and it would potentially also strengthen the Nordic identification competence, yeah, in the Nordic countries. So this material is expected to be made applicable on an app or program that would be easy to use, so we're also working on that. And though the material, as Annika said, primarily has been used or has been influenced by the perspective from the congenital field, it is meant to cover also the acquired field. And furthermore, we need to consider language, even between Danish and Norwegian. I think there is some words that are being used differently, and it might be a cause of misunderstanding sometimes. So translation into Nordic language is considered, and also into English. And Göran, he's sitting in the back of the room, is also working on that right now. Just to point to that. Yeah, if the material gets implemented in all of the Nordic countries, it's our hope that it will contribute to identify deafblindness more systematically in the Nordic countries. We still talk a lot about dark figures in our population, and some people that can be identified with deafblindness but don't, and therefore lack the deafblind specific competence and service and support that might change their lives. Furthermore, by having a systematic method that is being shared by the Nordic countries, it should be possible to collect larger sets of data to do research for the sake of the deafblind population. So yeah.
Can I just say one thing? And obviously also we have we collect medical information. That's one of the big bases of this. And also the tool, I totally forgot to say that. The tool is also, we call it an anamnese, but you maybe call it a kind of a medical interview or something? Anamnese. Do everybody understand what that is? Yeah? Yeah, that's very nice, because we don't often do that. So that's also the part of the material, how to collect type of medical, psychological, motorical, whatever genetics things that is important for doing this type of evaluation. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to sum up, thank you for your time. We will continue working on the project. That's a picture of some of the members that has been part of this project and has been part of the working groups. Yeah, this was especially in the education, yeah, on the education where we made a draft for that one. Yeah, and any comments and questions? There's a dog racing. It's, yeah, feet, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
But we have a question first. So, because when we were supposed, we did actually follow this thing we were supposed to do. Yeah. So, what do you guys think are the strengths and the weakness of doing in the identification in a functional manner? And I think you can draw that to the discussion you had in the start of the meeting or the session, and come back and we discuss it, all of us. Anyone eager to say something? Or you need maybe something a little there? Yeah, yeah.
What you can.
That's right. Thank you so much.
First of all, great presentation. We're big fans of identification of deafblindness. But what we saw in our research, because as you know, we're doing quite similar things, it's that it's highly connected to the person who's assessing the person with deafblindness. So if the assessor doesn't know the individual, the assessment is basically impossible, because they need to know everything from breathing, bodily functions, how do they move, how do they react to while being in the assessment. So I think that's a great weakness, but it can also be a great strength, because if we've got people who know the individual with deafblindness, then there can be quite the good identification process, but also saying, all right, that's what he can hear on a functional level, that's what he can see on a functional level. So yeah, but top.
Do you want to say something? Yeah, thank you. Good point. I think also this reflects a little bit of the service that are given maybe in the Nordic countries, and who does the actually identification of deafblindness in the Nordic countries. Even if it's very divided, still we do this in multidisciplinary teams. People get guidance, and as I said, for the most complex one, maybe this identification period can take up to 3-4 years, because you have to imply interventions. You have to make sure that the family or the staff members or whatever who are gonna do these things are there. And we also have the training of the that we are making, the training of who is doing this identification process. Yes, so we try to Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, and obviously we use video analysis when we look for the most complex sensory use. Yes.
I also think that here it's very worth mentioning the education, and mentioning that the competence in actually doing the identification is very important, really important, and a basic level of education in knowing about deafblindness and having deafblind competence, to actually use also video analysis.
And how to intervene within the bodily-tactile modality if that's needed, for example. So it's lots of training to do. Yeah.
So actually, because you just said about the intervening part, and I wrote that down as a question because I wasn't quite clear if that was the case. So what you're doing now is more of like an identification tool, but you said that, and that's what I thought of the figure, that you then make an intervention and then you test again to see if there's been any improvement or things that emerged or that are improving. But would you then also give ideas or material for that intervention? Is it a bit like the TVMS?
Yes, within the tool, when it goes digital, we have thought of having like help texts and suggestions for proper interventions due to this, how to observe different aspects of all the senses and yes, so it's going to be buttons.
Yeah,
if now due to this cue, for example, I push the button to explain the question maybe in head, and then also different intervention suggestions, for example. Yeah, that's also a part of it.
And another question, sorry for keeping the microphone, but for the assessment tool or the diagnostic tool, is it, for example, for hearing and vision, is it always the same by means it's just the, not just, but it's the items being used as a screening? Or is it also like a functional, like with the LIA symbols, you know, the vision, so that the visual capacity can be measured? Or is it every time the same process or protocol, or is it interchangeable?
I think one thing is assessing the sense, like the medical thing about it, the hearing or and then it's the aids and everything. That will leave to the medical persons. But to see how those senses impact those four areas, or the social life within the three domains. That's how we are drawing our attention. So obviously you need to have the medicals, the everything in. That's a part of your identification process.
But this stays with the medical, with the doctors and. All right. I didn't get that. All right.
So in Norway, like in Denmark and Norway, we do it a little bit different. In Norway, we have we have a multidisciplinary team of who just put the stamp. So I, as I did assessor, and due to this, I write my reports, collect all the information from different places, and I do the screening of the functional thing. And then I write my report, and I send it off to this multidisciplinary team with genetics and hearing doctors and sighting doctors and whatever. There are tons of people. And they decide, based on what I have been written, basically, if you get the stamp deafblind or not, because that brings in some services here. In Denmark, you operate differently because you don't have that solid team, you know, and so you do it within the expert organizations. But that's also multidisciplinary and based on the same processes in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think it's important to consider that in the structure there was 3 different parts, and we have a large introduction where you actually are getting some ideas on how to actually read and go through this process of identification. Before you do that, you also are considering the medical observations that's been made, and some of the stuff that's been, and afterwards you are doing the functional assessment. So considering all of these steps and actually identifying deafblindness, it's important. But using the functional definition as the benchmark,
Yeah, and basically, if it's like a person are deaf, you don't really consider doing a functional, using the functional part of it on on hearing, because the person doesn't have any residual hearing. And the opposite would if they are blind or totally deafblind and everything like that. Yeah. guys.
I have the very rude job of cutting you off now. I'm sorry. But, you know, this was a really, really great presentation. I think there's still lots of questions and lots of conversation. So my suggestion would be that you should all get together for a cup of coffee and carry this on for a couple more hours. But very good presentation. So Rasmus and Anik, I'd like to thank you for your sharing your knowledge this afternoon. And as a token of our appreciation, we have a small gift for each of you. So thank you very much.